Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this week's EPICENTER Psychosis Speaker Series. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Kyle Miner. Dr. Miner is the director of the Cognition, Language, and Affect and Serious Psychopathology Lab and associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Indiana University, Purdue University of Indianapolis here. And we're delighted to have him presenting today on the issue of assessing speech and psychosis. So with that, I'll turn things over to our distinguished speaker today, Dr. Kyle Miner.
Great. Thanks so much, Nick. It's really great to get a chance to...
Dr. Miner, I don't think we can hear you.
Oh, Can other people not hear me? I'm unmuted.
I can hear you. I think there's actually a problem on my end, so my apologies about that there.
Good. And hopefully everyone can see my screen as well. So yeah, it's great to get a chance to speak with everyone today. As Nick mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about assessing speech and psychosis. So over the next, 50 minutes, 55 minutes, I'm going to talk about a number of different things. So I'll just start in by talking about what disorganized speech is. I know a lot of this audience is going to be pretty familiar with it, but I'll talk about what it is specifically, and more importantly, why it matters, why we need to focus and to study this symptom of psychosis. Then I'll switch gears a bit and talk about a few different ways that we've assessed disorganized speech in our lab. So I'll talk about clinician-rated scales, I'll talk about trained rater approaches, and then automated analysis as well. So I'll give some advantages and disadvantages to these different types of methodologies. And hopefully one of the points I want to come back to today is that, there are advantages and disadvantages of all these approaches. It's not an either-or proposition. I'll talk a bit about integration as well. So I'll talk about these ways, and then I'll drill a little bit deeper by showing you how we've used these different methodologies to study speech and psychosis. So I'll give you an overview of a couple different studies. So one where we used a trained rater approach, and then a second study where we actually used both automated analysis and clinician-rated scales, but I'll focus mostly on automated analysis. Then I'll wrap up by, I'll spend the last maybe 5 or 10 minutes of this talk just focusing on some different avenues where I see this area of research going, and certainly where it's going in our lab. So I'll talk about getting speech samples in everyday life. I'll talk about treatment of disorganized speech, which I think is a really critical area to move toward. And then I'll leave 5 to 10 minutes at the end just for Q&A. So I think the way that this is set up, you're going to send your questions into the chat, and Nick will ask them at the end. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have. The last slide will also have my email address. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me and ask questions if one pops up later. So I'll start by just talking about formal thought disorder more generally, which is this core feature of psychotic disorders. And what it really is a disruption in how ideas, thoughts are organized and maintained in our mind. So you can see the illustration here. I mean, this is a situation where our ideas, our thoughts are really tangled up. And the clinical manifestation of formal thought disorder is disorganized speech. So these disorganized, poorly maintained thoughts, they come out as disorganized speech. A lot of times disorganized speech is described in these terms as being like tangential, circumstantial, incoherent. And at the extreme ends, that's what you see a lot of times. But there are a lot of variations, a lot of gradients of what disorganized speech looks like. The way that I always like to think about disorganized speech is just to think, for you to take a minute and think about how you organize your own ideas. Whenever you talk with other people, whenever you you want to communicate, you want to do so in a linear fashion. So you want to go from point A to point B to point C. People with disorganized speech, they may go from point A to point C to point F. They may go from point A to point F back to point C. But essentially what happens is, it takes a lot of resources for the listener to be able to follow what the speaker's saying. So it makes them put a lot more effort in. This is really challenging for the listener, but it's challenging for the speaker as well. So there's this situation where they're not able to communicate their thought process. And this is one of the reasons why it matters. So I'll give you a little bit of just a background on how frequent this is. So usually about half of people with psychosis have some level of disorganization. This is a symptom that really persists even during periods of remission. So when other symptoms are remitting, a lot of times you still see disorganization present. And then it's also linked, as you can imagine, based on what I've said, it's linked to poor functioning in a number of different areas. So, educational attainment, work functioning, social functioning, they're all impacted by disorganized speech. So this kind of gets back to the point I made on the previous slide. So it's difficult for the listener, but there are also real challenges that come into play for the speaker as well. I mean, this is a situation where, I know for me, like whenever I want to explain things to someone and I can see that my point is not getting across, I'm not explaining it as well as I want to, that's incredibly frustrating. This is an experience that happens all the time for people with disorganized speech. So yeah, our lab has published a meta-analysis where we looked at these associations between formal thought disorder and social functioning. So there are these prominent associations that are there. And of course, we know that the functional deficits that people with psychosis experience, they account for a large part of the economic burden that's faced as well. So, hopefully that has made the impression of why it's important to assess disorganized speech, why it's important to think about this symptom. Now I want to talk a bit about ways that disorganized speech can be assessed. So I'll start with clinician-rated scales. Clinician-rated scales is a widely used way that disorganized speech is measured. Typically what happens, there's an interviewer and there is a client. They will talk, and as the client goes through this clinical interview, the interviewer will rate their speech on some type of ordinal scale. So, something like the PANS uses conceptual disorganization to try to capture this. So there's this 1 to 7 scale where you're rating someone from absent to extremely severe. Other scales like the SAPS have multiple scales that rate disorganization. And there are a lot of advantages and disadvantages to this type of approach. So the advantages really come into play in terms of efficiency. So, it's less time consuming, less costly mostly in terms of time compared to the other measures that I'm going to talk about. They're also widely used, so you can compare, what you find in your study to other studies a lot more readily than maybe using some of these other methodologies. But there are disadvantages as well. So, the ordinal ratings can make it challenging to capture specific behaviors. So I think really the disadvantages here are related to specificity. So getting into specific behaviors that you're seeing can be challenging with these types of scales. And there's also challenges with the, clinician interpretation of what differences on the scale mean. So anyone mean, I think all of us could differentiate someone who's a 1 from a 7 on these scales, but the places within the scales, like a 3 to 4 or a 4 to 5, that's where it gets pretty challenging. And because you're not looking at specific behaviors, it's also challenging to be able to look at the specific components of language and where they break down as well. So the other two approaches are more specific in terms of how they look at language. It's not an overall rating score. You're actually going through types of behavior. So, you know, the second method I'll talk about is the trained rater approach. This is where you have a rating group and you train the group to use a standardized validated system. You usually go through some form of speech samples that participants have generated or clients have generated to identify specific instances of disorganization. So for example, you know, you can use something like the Communication Disturbances Index or the CDI. The Thought Disorder Index is another trained rater approach that's often used. But you look at speech samples. So these aren't full speech samples, but they're just examples of sentences. And you typically go through and you rate areas where disorganization occurs based on that rating system. So there's usually some type of explanation as to why what you are coding as disorganization counts as disorganization. So the advantages and disadvantages of this type of approach, probably apparent to people. I mean, the advantages, they're really the inverse of what I talked about with the clinician rated scales. You can really get into specific behaviors here. So you can look at where disorganization occurred and what happened before it. So that can be really useful for testing mechanisms. You can see what the person was talking about before disorganization occurred, what they talked about after it, what they were talking about during that disorganized segment. So you can get at mechanisms a little more clearly here, a little more cleanly. Disadvantages, people, I mean, I'm sure this is coming to mind for people. There's a time cost involved in this. So training people to be able to learn this system and to apply it in a valid way, it's time intensive, and you've got to continue to do trainings to protect against rater drift. And then just the time cost of going through the speech samples, can be intensive as well. So you can get really good data from this, but there is a time cost that's involved here. And then the third way is a method that's really gained prominence the past, 5 or 10 years. A lot of systems have been developed to apply automated analysis to speech. So this is a system, this is a methodology where you use classifiers to rate characteristics of speech. So usually you're using something like artificial intelligence. So Cheryl Corcoran, who I know gave one of the early talks here, here at the EPICENTER seminar series, she's someone that's been a real leader in this field. But there are a number of groups that are publishing data, including ours, that are using this type of approach to look at disorganization and formal thought disorder. So another system that I know myself and some people on this that are listening to this talk have used before is something called the co-matrix. But a lot of times what these systems are doing is they're trying to look at organization at different levels within the speech sample. So within sentences, across paragraphs, between sentences, how is speech being organized? So there are advantages of this approach. You usually have multiple scales to help rate the specific behaviors, the specific areas where speech is disorganized. And you also leverage strength across multiple fields. So, I mean, I think about the work we've done in this area. I mean, we've worked with people in engineering, informatics, computer science, several other areas. So you're really leveraging some of the gold standard methods across multiple fields to try to rate disorganization. Disadvantages, this isn't as time consuming as the trained rater approach, but there is still a time commitment to the transcription part if you're rating speech samples. Yeah, so there is a time commitment there, but once the transcription's done, it's automated. The other challenge is the difficulty of training and testing valid models to be able to rate a complex behavior like speech. So speech is one of the most complex behaviors that humans engage in. You can take something like sarcasm. That's a low rate behavior, but when it happens, it can throw off whatever system you have. So you have to have ways to account for many of the complexities that occur with speech. So yeah, this is a real challenge. I mean, of course, the models that you come up with and you use are only as good as the classifiers that you've trained and tested. So there's a lot of front-end work on designing a model that can assess all of the complexities of something like speech. So that's a brief overview of the different methodologies. So let me drill a little bit deeper and talk about some studies that we've run and published in our lab that use these different types of approaches. So I'll start by talking about a study that we published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology a few years ago. It's a pilot study in a first episode psychosis population. And then I'll talk about a second study we ran in a schizophrenia cohort where we compared automated analysis to a clinician rated scale. So across both studies, the primary analysis is going to be on speech, but if you read those slides a minute ago, you'll also notice that there's a focus on cognitive deficits as well. I mean, cognitive deficits, of course, is a really critical part of psychosis and a critical part of formal thought disorder as well. I mean, this ties right back into that first slide I showed you, where about the maintenance and the organization within people's minds of thoughts and how how the output is really disorganized speech. So I talked about how there are functional impairments that are apparent in these areas, but of course in psychosis, cognitive deficits are prominent here as well. So I'll just set up the rationale very briefly for our trained rater study. I mean, essentially what we wanted to do was try to use the trained rater approach to look at both disorganization and as well as systems that might lead to increases in disorganization. So our aims in this study were, the first one's the simplest one. I mean, we wanted to look at, is disorganized speech increased in the first episode group in all three conditions that we ran. The second one has to do with reactivity. So we were interested in whether we saw increased reactivity in the first episode psychosis group. So the example here, I'll use negative affect as an example. So we expected everyone to see an increase when they went from the baseline to the negative affect condition in their level of disorganization. We just expected that line to be steeper in the first episode psychosis group. And then finally, we wanted to look at how disorganization and reactivity were related to functioning, so to social and role functioning. So essentially, this is what we're doing in this study. We want to look at disorganized speech. First off, can we show impairments using this trained rater approach in a first episode compared to healthy control group? Then we wanted to look at potential mechanisms, so cognitive load, negative affect. Does that increase the level of disorganization in one group? And then finally, how does disorganization and reactivity, how are they related to people's functioning? So like I mentioned, this was a pilot study. So this is the inclusion-exclusion criteria. For the sake of time, I'll just put it up here. The one thing I do want to point out is that we matched our two groups on age, sex, race, and ethnicity. So they were really evenly matched in demographic on demographic variables. Then they came to our lab, or really our center, our first episode center, and they participated in this speech paradigm that we set up. So they discussed memories across 3 different conditions. So in the baseline condition, they discussed neutral memories. The negative affect condition, they discussed negative memories. The cognitive load condition, they again discussed neutral memories, but now they're doing a cognitive task, a one-back visual working memory task while they're speaking. So this is designed to be a pretty simple cognitive task, but we're wanting to see, when they're doing 2 things at once, does that increase their level of disorganization? So this is just an example of what they saw on the screen for the negative affect condition. So they would be looking at a computer screen just like you are, and they would see this come up in front of them. So it would say, tell us some stories about when you were feeling really bad. Please get into telling this story as much as you can and talk for 2 minutes. And then there would be some prompts there in case they got stuck. So whenever they were ready, they would press a key, the prompts would still be there, and the recording would begin. So they would be looking at their screen. We want them talking for the full 2 minutes or as much of it as we can without the interviewer speaking. Then we would transcribe their speech and rate it using the communication disturbance index, which I showed you an example of earlier. So this is just this validated behaviorally based measure where you rate disorganized speech segments, and essentially what you do at the end is look at the percentage, the number of speech segments, and how many words they generated to get a ratio score for what frequency of their speech is disorganized. Then we use the social and role functioning scales, which I'm guessing many of you all are familiar with, to look at social and role functioning. So these are 1 to 10 scales that look at functioning. So what we found in this study, unsurprisingly, disorganized speech was elevated in the first episode group across all 3 conditions. The large effect size that we saw were really consistent with what we've seen in previous studies using a trained rater approach in chronic and prolonged schizophrenia samples, which suggests that disorganized speech, it may be at peak severity or at least near peak severity shortly after psychosis emerges, which could indicate a window, kind of a critical period for being able to treat this symptom. I'll talk about some areas for treatment in a little bit, but we thought that this could indicate a period where people may be more responsive to treatment. In terms of reactivity, you could probably tell this from just looking at the effect sizes here. We didn't see cognitive reactivity. We did see effective reactivity in this study as well. So it was only apparent in the FEP group that there was this increase in disorganization when you went from baseline to the negative affect condition, which may point to the importance of negative affect in this group, and particularly might point to the importance of looking at people who show this elevated affective reactivity and being aware as a therapist that they may be more reactive whenever stress-laden topics are discussed in therapy, and you may want to implement some emotion regulation strategies with with those individuals. And then finally, we looked at how disorganization and reactivity were associated with functioning, social and role functioning. And the takeaway findings are really observed when we looked at social functioning. So what we found here were really strong relationships, large effect size relationships between disorganization, reactivity, and worse social functioning. This may be predictive. So people who are really reactive may also be the people that are at the highest risk for having this, larger disruption to their social lives, to their social relationships. Okay, so there are a number of strengths and limitations of this study. The interest of time, I'll just kind of put them up here mostly. So the strengths really just kind of tie into what I've talked about. So we've designed this really nice experimental paradigm to be able to look at both disorganization and how it changes across different conditions. So as someone who teaches assessment 1 to students, a big proponent of the multi-trait, multi-method matrix, it would have been nice to have had a behaviorally based measure of functioning to match our behaviorally based speech measure in this study. That's something that we're doing in a follow-up. Of course, this was a pilot study, as I noted. And then I think an important point that I'll just touch on here, and then I'll get back to when I moved into next steps, is that there's a lot of really nice things. Like, we can design these really nice, sophisticated experiments in the lab. We can standardize the environment really nicely in the lab to, induce, cognitive load and negative affect. But people don't come from standardized environments. And a lab setting is, inherently artificial. So this speech that people are generating, in clinical interviews or in experiments like the one I've just shown you, they may not reflect, they don't reflect the speech and the conversations that people have in everyday life. So one area that, we think is really important to focus on is increasing ecological validity. So I'll put a pin in that comment for now, and we'll get back to that when we move towards next steps. So the study that used automated analysis, so this is a study that was published last year in Psychological Medicine. I've kind of already talked about what automated analysis is here. So the goal in this study was really to look at how can we use automated analysis to illustrate the strong relationships that we know exist from previous studies between disorganization, disorganized speech, and cognitive deficits. So our goal was to look at, does automated analysis show these relationships, and can it account for unique variance above and beyond what we see using clinician-rated scales, which again are the most commonly used scales for assessing disorganization. So yeah, in this study, our aims were to use clinical interviews, so speech from clinical interviews, run automated analysis on these speech samples, and see if it could identify relationships between disorganization and 3 different types of cognitive functioning. We expected that automated analysis would account for unique variance in these cognitive deficits above and beyond what we see using a clinician-rated scale. But then also, to get back to the point I raised early on in this talk, we also think integration is really important. So we also wanted to see, when you combine these 2 methods together, the strengths of these two methods. What is the amount of variance that can be accounted for using both of them? So for this study, we had 81 people with a schizophrenia spectrum disorder. This is the primary inclusion-exclusion criteria. I'll note that these were participants who were part of a randomized controlled trial that looked at the effectiveness of cognitive remediation. Of course, this was only baseline data, so this was before they were randomized to a treatment arm in the clinical trial. So we wanted to look at their speech generated across a clinical interview. So the clinical interview we used is one that our group commonly uses. So it's the Indiana Psychiatric Illness Interview, or the IPI, which you'll probably hear about more next week. I saw that my colleague Paul Leisiger is going to be speaking at this series. So I'll preview the IPI for you, and then you'll probably hear more about it. So the reason we selected the IPI is because of its open-ended nature. So it has a few prompts within the interview, but it is primarily a clinical interview where the client, our participant in this case, talks for a long period of time. There's little interruption from the interviewer, and the place where the most amount of speech is generated is to the opening prompt, which is on the screen right here. So the interviewer says, I'd like you to tell me the story of your life in as much detail as you can from as early as you can remember up until now. And then the person, they tell you about their life. We like that because of the open-ended nature and because it's not effectively valent. So people can read into that however they want, and they can generate speech that tells you about the negative events of their life or the positive events of their life with little influence from the interviewer. It's the open-ended part of this is also nice because it results in a wide distribution of in terms of how long it is and the amount of speech generated. So it's generally about 30 to 60 minutes, but we have many interviews that are less than 30 minutes. We have several interviews that are longer than an hour. You can see this just from this particular study. The mean amount of words that were generated by participants were about 2,800. So a lot of words are being generated, and looking at that standard deviation, you can see that there's a lot of variation across our sample. So within one standard deviation, it's anywhere from 700 words to 5,000 words. So you're getting enough speech, even in those people who don't generate as much, and you're getting a lot of speech. This is something, it'd be really hard to do this using a trained rater approach, but using automated analysis, this is something that's doable. So then we recorded and transcribed these interviews. And for this particular study, we used the CoMatrix, which is a discourse processing software that analyzes language by measuring cohesion. In previous studies from our group, we've shown the ability, the CoMatrix is demonstrated that it can differentiate people high and low in disorganization, and also healthy adults from people with schizophrenia. The full CoMatrix has a lot of indices across many different categories. You can see right there, which it really emphasizes the importance of really calling your shots before and coming up with the indices that you think are most important before you run the data. So it includes both simple indices and then more complex indices. And the indices that we selected, I'll just put on the screen for you. We decided to select, after consulting with people who designed the CoMatrix and talking, within our group, we decided to include 7 different indices. So 2 simple indices, and we selected these based on previous studies showing that the disorganization is highly related to these types of indexes. And then the complex indices, they have several, but there's a study by the creators of the co-matrix where they showed that these 5 account for the majority of the variance in terms, so they're the 5 most important ones. So that's why we selected these 5, and there's a brief description here showing what they're designed to measure. In terms of measuring our cognitive constructs, for neurocognition, we use the matrix, with the one exception being that the mesquite was excluded from the matrix and it was used as a measure of social cognition. So we had 4 different social cognition measures. We calculated a composite score from these 4 different measures. And then for metacognition, we used the MASS-A, which Paul will undoubtedly be talking to you all about next week as well. So you'll learn more about the MASS-A again next week. So these slides are a little bit busier than those earlier ones, so I'll just try to summarize what we found. So I would say first that we found that at least one of the complex indexes was related to each type of cognitive deficit. So, what we found looking at this is that people with poor neurocognition and poor social cognition, they tended to demonstrate a speaking style that made the listener work harder to be able to understand their meaning. And then people with low metacognition tended to have lower referential cohesion, meaning that they refer less back to ideas that they had already brought up, which makes it harder for a listener to be able to connect their meaning, to connect one idea to something that they were talking about earlier. And then neurocognition and metacognition were related to a simple index as well. Okay, in terms of this slide, let me just summarize it because it is even busier. What we found when we looked at the unique variance accounted for by the automated scale above and beyond the clinician rated scale, there was quite a bit of range here. So it was anywhere from just a small amount of variance for social cognition to more moderate amount for neurocognition and a larger amount of unique variance for metacognition, meaning that there are strengths and weaknesses we found in this study of this type of approach. But one thing that was interesting and fairly consistent is that when you combine these 2 methodologies, it accounted for about between 1/4 and 1/3 of the variance in each of these cognitive deficits. So not everything, not the majority, but a pretty substantial amount of variance was accounted for by these 2 different measures of disorganization. Yeah, so in terms of strengths, I've kind of already hit on those. So let me talk a little bit more about limitations, particularly this first piece. So one of the limitations of this area of research, meaning automated analysis, this methodology, is that there's not a lot of work out there looking at the test-retest reliability of these types of methods. And that's really important for moving this field forward. We, of course, in this study only collected data at one time point because then they were in a clinical trial. But we have an ongoing study right now where we have multiple time points, and we're actually collaborating with Cheryl Corcoran's group and looking at the test-retest reliability of some of these automated measures. Yeah, and then, of course, there wasn't a control group in this particular study either. But we had in previous studies shown that, disorganization was higher in the schizophrenia group controlled compared to a control group using these automated indices. So let me talk about 3 next steps, and I'll just talk about this first one very briefly, and then I'll use the rest of my time before the question and answer section to talk about the other 2. So in terms of next steps, one thing that probably stands out, and I've already started talking about this with the psych medicine study, is that it's really important to compare these different methodologies to see what are the strengths in of these different methods. So what are the unique strengths of these different methods for rating disorganization from different sources? So I think understanding that is really important to figuring out, what are the benefits of using one measure compared to another one in terms of getting reliable and valid data. So I think that next step is fairly self-explanatory, although I'm happy to answer questions at the end about it. The next two I'll just present here, and then I'll have a few slides on them. So I've already talked about, one area that we're really focused on and think is important is collecting speech samples in people's everyday environments. And then one of maybe the most critical area in terms of moving this line of research forward is related to treatment. There's not a lot of good data showing that disorganized speech or formal thought disorder is very responsive to treatment. So I'll talk about that as well. So the second next step is really, why is it important? Why do we think it's important to collect speech samples in everyday life? So I touched on this a little bit earlier, and I think there are a couple ways. So there are some really nice things we can do in the lab. We can design these sophisticated experiments, but these experiments both don't mimic what people actually go through. We standardize everything in the lab, but people don't go back to standardized environments. And also, the situations in the lab can't replicate people's actual interactions with other people. So I always like to use this as the example for that point. It's just, think for a minute about one of the most simple interactions that you have every day. You've probably had this interaction already today, which is, how are you doing? How have you been? To answer that question, you have to process a lot of different things. Usually, subconsciously, you're processing many different things. A couple of examples are on this slide, but there's more than just what's on this slide. Just to kind of to figure out, do I just give the automated good, how are you response? Or is this a situation where the expectation is, or it's okay for me to, be a little more real, to actually tell them how I'm feeling and to launch into a discussion about what is actually going on with me. So, this is a very simple interaction. Most of our interactions are even more complex, and there are more things going on. So I think it's really important to look at the types of conversations that people are having and how the different situations influence the disorganized speech that people exhibit, that they demonstrate across, different situations. So just talk briefly about how we collect this data. We have people come to our lab, they undergo, clinical interviews, they do all of the testing that we're interested in the lab. And then before they leave the lab, we give them a device. In the past, it's been an iPod Touch. We're now using Androids, and it has this app on it that records the environment around people. So they leave our lab with the device, and for a few days, they wear the device around while they're engaging in their everyday interactions or whatever it is they're doing. At pre-programmed intervals, the app kicks on and it records whatever's going on around that person. So, it's a really nice measure of both the type of speech that people generate, the amount of speech they generate, and, social functioning as well. So we've run this in several studies. So I'll just show you a little bit of data from a schizotypy study that we published. We have a schizophrenia study under review that kind of replicates some of this as well. But essentially, we use multi-level modeling to look at how people high in schizotypy, how their speech differs from people low in schizotypy. And we found in people's everyday interactions, people high in schizotypy, they use a greater frequency of negative emotion words. And they also speak a lot less than people low in schizotypy. So this shows the raw data, which probably doesn't translate, probably doesn't mean that much to you in terms of, the amount of words per file. But when you extrapolate this across a day, this basically is calculated out as people high in schizotypy speaking about 45 minutes less a day than people low in schizotypy. So there are meaningful differences there. And I'm happy to answer any other questions about like how we collect this data, how we partner with people for them to feel comfortable giving us this data, which we do. They have to approve their files and can delete anything. But yeah, I'll hold that in. If people have questions, I'm happy to answer them. But I want to wrap up by talking about treatment studies as well. So, one of the consistent findings in research is that there are not a lot of treatments designed, and there aren't a lot of positive results out there in terms of reducing disorganized speech. So Aaron Beck and his group have referred to this as one of the least explored and least treated symptoms in psychosis. For the most part, or not even for the most part, really, there aren't psychosocial interventions that, at least that I know of, that are designed to target formal thought disorder. Most of the psychosocial interventions, they are broadly focused on other symptoms, or they may be focused on improving different skill deficits, so things like social skills training or cognitive remediation. But yeah, there really just aren't these types of interventions designed to treat thought disorder. So in our group, we've been piloting some data with our group and our larger group, including Paul, where we're really interested in looking at whether metacognitive therapy can help reduce the level of disorganized speech and formal thought disorder that people exhibit. So there are a lot of metacognitive therapies that have been developed and are out there. I know Nick and people at the EPICENTER use some of these. I work, we use the one that Paul Lysaker developed, and he's going to be talking about this, I think, at length next week. So it's a therapy called Merit, where essentially the goal of the therapy is to partner with the client to be able to change the way that they think about how they view themselves and other people in the world, to change their thought process, to make them become more thoughtful about this. And we think by improving metacognition, like if you use something like the NIMH experimental therapeutics paradigm, we think that using this type of therapy, targeting metacognition, is one way that we may be able to see reductions in a really important clinical outcome, which in this case would be disorganized speech. So in terms of Merit, there are promising results in case studies in a recent RCT, not necessarily with disorganized speech, but we do have, so Matt Margraf, one of my former graduate students, did conduct a pilot study for his dissertation where he looked at whether Merit could result in reductions in disorganized speech after just 12 weeks of therapy. And there were some exciting findings here, although they're couched. I'll tell you some of the caveats in a second. But using automated analysis, he was able to show that after just 12 weeks of Merit, that people, they showed these medium effect size improvements in their level of disorganization. And the one index where the largest improvements were shown is the index that really measures the connections between topics. So we think this is really promising. One caveat here is that we only found this medium effect size using the automated measure. We didn't see it using when we rated disorganization using a clinician rated measure. So we've got a follow-up study that we're hoping to get off the ground. We're writing grants for it right now, where we are wanting to recruit a larger sample and to recruit people that have higher levels of disorganization to see if merit is able to reduce the level of disorganization in people with schizophrenia. So I want to stop there, and I'll just summarize what I've kind of talked about over the last hour, because I want to make sure that we have time to get to your questions. So yeah, in this talk, I've really hopefully conveyed why disorganized speech is an important symptom across the psychosis spectrum. I've talked in detail about different ways that you can assess disorganized speech in psychosis, and then drilled deeper and talked about how we've done this in studies from our lab. And then I wrapped up by kind of talking about some of the next steps, the avenues where I see this line of research going, and certainly where we're going in our lab. So yeah, and then I showed some of our data as well. So I do want to, before I end, just spend a minute with saying some thank you. So as all of us know, I'm the person talking about this work, but it certainly isn't just me that's conducting all of this work. So we have a number of different collaborators on studies in the past, studies we're doing right now, studies that we've worked on that have really made incredible contributions to this. And that includes both current and former graduate students in my lab who, a lot of these ideas, a lot of this analysis is theirs. So, they certainly, share in all of this work. So I want to thank them, thank our funding sources, and then stop by saying if for some reason you come up with a question later or we can't get to it in this next 5 to 10 minutes, please don't hesitate to email me. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. And with that, I'll stop talking and I'll turn it over to Nick, who's going to ask questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Miner, for a wonderful talk here today. We've had a number of questions come in the chat that I'll relay to you here. First one, within individuals with psychosis that have disorganized speech, do we know how common it is to have insight into whether others are confused or not following what they're saying?
Yeah, this is a really good question, a really important question. And I don't know that, the short answer is I don't know that we do have that data. We do, so we know that people with disorganized speech have poor insight into their illness across the board. Whether they have poor insight into whether people are able to follow their train of thought is a different question. And at least I'm not aware of studies where that has specifically been measured. But it would serve to reason that it's probably lower than you would see in a more general psychosis group. But there's a variation across across that scale.
There's a second part to that question. Are there ways to test this, the idea of insight into disorganized speech?
Yeah, so I think you could set up studies that test that. Certainly, we have not done that. But I think it's really coming up with some type of insight scale that is specific to the question you're asking. So, asking them questions about, and there are questions out there in scales about self-reported disorganization. If you could design it in a way to where it's asking them specifically about whether, other people can't follow their train of thought, and their insight into that. I think you could design studies that do that, but yeah, you would have to be really careful about how you go about it.
Great. So next question. Have you compared outcomes of spoken speech analysis to written speech samples within the same cohort, and do you see the same relationships?
Yeah, great question. We have not done that to date. We are doing that right now. So we are actually having people, we're doing kind of similar to the trained rater approach that I showed you, where people are writing about, they're speaking in these different conditions. We're now having people write narratives that are effectively valenced, and we can compare those. So that is a next step that we're interested in doing and are currently collecting data on, but we haven't done that to date.
Okay, next question, which I think you might have anticipated some of this when you were talking about the ear earlier here. How do individuals with underlying paranoia respond when you ask them to wear the ear device that records them?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and it comes up every time I talk about the ear or this line of work. So it's really a lot of partnering on the front end with clients. So of course we're upfront about what the device is. We have a long explanation for what it is, how to explain it to people. We talk to them about how much of the day, so it records about 5% of their day whenever they're wearing it. We tell them about this. The other big part is we are upfront with them about, the fact that when they bring the device back, they get to hear the files before anyone from our team does. They get to delete anything that they don't want us to have, no questions asked. So that front end work is really important for being able to partner with people. To make them, you can't make them completely comfortable, but making them as comfortable as possible with the data that they're giving us. And of course, like with any study, if they want to drop out at any point, or if they, don't want to wear the ear, they of course are not, they don't do that.
Okay, and the last question that has come in actually comes from Dr. Cheryl Corcoran, who you mentioned a couple times here during the talk right here. And I'll start off by where she starts off with is first of compliments about the rigor of your research and studies of importance of affect in relation to cognition and these naturalistic studies. She notes it's very cool that you present some data suggesting that you might have an intervention that could potentially move the needle with regard to disorganized speech, and had question about did the intervention improve other aspects of functioning potentially at all, maybe quality of life or subjective reports from participants that they felt it was helpful with speech?
Yeah. So this is a great question. And yes, we do have data on that. So quality of life did increase. So you'll notice, one of the things I talked about is that conceptual disorganization was pretty low in this sample because we didn't target it necessarily with our pilot study. We're going to target it in our follow-ups to make sure we get people with high enough conceptual disorganization. What we were targeting or what we were hoping to move the needle on in this particular study is exactly what she mentioned, which is quality of life and social functioning. And in this study, so we found improvements in quality of life and did not find significant improvements in social functioning. So we saw some improvements, but they were more, I think, on the small effect size side. Whereas the quality of life improvements and what I showed you using the automated scale for disorganization is, more in the range of medium effects.
Great. Well, Dr. Miner, I'd like to thank you again for an amazing presentation today here. And thanks to everyone for joining us for today's presentation. We'll hope you'll be able to join us next week where we have Dr. Paul Lysaker speaking about the merit metacognitive intervention for individuals with psychosis. Take care, everyone, and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.